Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of ancient history's most glamorously confusing mysteries. Why Egyptian pharaohs never seemed to settle on just one crown. Imagine you're standing on the banks of the Nile at sunrise. The air is thick with heat and incense. Papyrus boats float lazily by, ibis birds picking their way through the shallows, and somewhere behind you, a conch horn moans like a sleepy hippo. Today, you're about to witness a coronation. But here's the catch: your royal host doesn't just slide on one glittering symbol of power and call it a day. No. No. This pharaoh has an entire lineup of crowns, each more dramatic than the last, waiting off stage like they're auditioning for a reality show. It's not just royal extravagance or some ancient form of indecision. These crowns have rules, meanings, vibes. One says, "I conquered you." Another says, "The gods like me more than you." A third says, "Yes, I'm literally the son of Ra. And yes, that's a cobra on my forehead, deal with it." And yet, despite all the fanfare, we've never actually found a real one. Not a single complete royal crown has ever been dug up from an Egyptian tomb. You'd think at least one would have turned up in the back of a sarcophagus closet, maybe behind some dusty canopic jars and a pyramid-shaped paperweight. But nope, nada. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle your feet on the warm stone tiles, squinting past the flickering torches toward a platform draped in linen. The high priest of Amun is already there, holding something that looks like a fancy bowling pin. That's not your standard Burger King crown. This is the white crown of Upper Egypt, the Hedjet. It's tall, elegant, and kind of looks like it was designed by a minimalist pasta chef. A moment later, a second crown appears. The red crown of Lower Egypt, the Deshret. It's flatter, with a curled, stick-like protrusion at the front. Together, they symbolize the unification of the two lands, and yes, when you smush them together, you get the double crown, the Shente visual equivalent of a political merger with strong logo game. But here's the weird part. This isn't just about aesthetics. Each crown carries an invisible contract. You don the white crown, and boom, you're expected to rule over Upper Egypt's highlands and temples with divine favor. Slip on the red crown, and suddenly, you've promised to manage the Delta's chaos and its reed-choked bureaucracy. Put them both on? Now you're claiming to be the one true king, boss of both ends of the Nile, answerable to gods, crocodiles, and your grandmother's opinion all at once. And don't even think about mixing up the symbolism. If you wore the wrong crown in the wrong context, people noticed. You wouldn't wear flip-flops to a funeral. Right? Well, same principle here, except imagine the flip-flops are imbued with cosmic order and controlled the fertility of the flood season. The symbolism doesn't stop there. When you look closely at ancient temple walls, it becomes clear that pharaohs wore different crowns, depending on where they were in Egypt and who they were trying to impress. Visiting a temple in Karnak? Better bring the Hedjet. Touring Memphis? That's Deshret territory. Doing both in one trip? Pack your shent. And maybe a neck bracelets, a long day of divine obligations. Historians still argue whether these crowns were actually physical objects, the king switched out like a sleepy toddler playing dress-up, or if they were more ceremonial symbols, conjured through art and ritual. Some even speculate that these various crowns weren't worn so much as invoked, represented in wall reliefs, statues, and dreams. In the same way, modern CEOs don't always wear power ties anymore. Maybe pharaohs had assistants whose whole job was to visualize the crown's energy, while their boss just rocked a bald head and a sunburn. Speaking of bald heads, you glance around the crowd and realize something else about this coronation. Nearly everyone here is shaved. Smooth scalps glisten in the sun, adorned with gold bands and beaded wigs. The high priest might be holding the crowns, but he's also wearing a leopard skin cloak and sporting eyeliner that could stop traffic. Everything is layered with meaning, ceremony, and the kind of aesthetic commitment that would make a fashion influencer weep. But even in this moment of supreme ritual, the variety of crowns seems like overkill. Why couldn't they just pick one? You imagine the pharaoh, backstage, sighing as a royal stylist, insists on crown number 5, the keprish, also called the blue war crown. This one doesn't have a clear origin. Some scholars think it was worn in battle. Others say it was for festivals. Some believe it was only ever depicted in art, not actually constructed at all. You can't help but picture a royal scribe scribbling frantic notes as the king changes headgear for the 5th time that day. Still, each crown tells a different story, a different version of what it means to rule a land both unified and wildly diverse. Egypt wasn't a monolith, it was reeds and deserts, crocodiles and calendars, feasts and famine. Maybe wearing different crowns wasn't indecision, it was diplomacy. A way to speak multiple cultural languages at once, to show power without saying a word. And it wasn't just about politics, it was cosmic. The crowns tied into Ma'at, the ancient Egyptian concept of balance and divine order. The pharaoh didn't just rule land, he maintained harmony between heaven and earth. Changing crowns was like switching gears in a celestial machine. You wore the red crown to command the physical world, the white crown to channel spiritual authority. Together, they made you the human linchpin between gods and mortals, a walking Wi-Fi signal for divine approval. At the back of the crowd, an elderly scribe leans against a stone pillar, muttering that he's seen 33 coronations in his lifetime, and not a single one went without a wardrobe malfunction. One time, he says, the priest dropped the hedjet and it rolled into the Nile. They called it an omen. Took 4 oxen to fish it out. You smile politely and pretend to believe him. The sun climbs higher as the ceremony unfolds. The pharaoh raises his arms, flanked by priests and musicians, lotus petals floating down like sleepy confetti. On his head is the freshly combined double crown, and on his face, that signature pharaonic stillness. Half god, half bureaucrat, all drama. And just when you think it's over, just when the incense has cleared and the conch horn moans its final note, you see a servant scurry forward with yet another crown. This one shaped like a sun disk, ringed by cobras and flanked by horns. Ah, of course. The crown of Ra. Because why settle for dual sovereignty when you can also throw solar deity into the mix? You're still in the crowd, still swaying slightly from the heady mix of heat, music, and the overwhelming scent of lotus oil. The coronation may be over, but the crowns? Oh no, they're just getting started. Because tonight, you're going to find out that the white crown and the red crown weren't just dramatic headpieces, they were the visual shorthand for one of the longest and pettiest rivalries in ancient history: Upper Egypt versus Lower Egypt. Now, Upper Egypt is actually the south, and Lower Egypt is in the north, because ancient Egyptians, in their eternal habit of keeping us humble, named their regions based on the flow of the Nile, not compass directions. The Nile flows north, so upstream was upper and downstream was lower. Logical, right? Just not the kind of logic that helps you pass a geography quiz. So why 2 regions? And more importantly, why 2 completely different hats? Picture yourself drifting backward in time, centuries before the pyramids, into a land of independent gnomes local districts ruled by chieftains who probably argued about cow taxes and canal rights. Lower Egypt in the north was a marshy, green tangle of papyrus and fish, crowded with settlements and excellent at agriculture. Upper Egypt, by contrast, was narrower, rockier, and home to fewer but more powerful religious center temples with columns bigger than your sleep-deprived brain can fathom. Eventually, a king from the south, maybe Narmer, maybe someone else. Historians still argue whether Narmer and Menes were the same guy or just part of some ancient rebranding campaign marched north and said, "Nice delta you've got there, I'll take it." Cue the unification of Egypt around 3100 BCE, and with it, the two crowns became one, at least in theory. The Hedjet of Upper Egypt tall, sleek, like an inverted bowling pin. The Deshret of Lower Egypt flatter, red, with a curious squiggly bit that makes it look like a stylized mosquito's proboscis. When you combine them, you get the Shenta double crown that's more of a conceptual sandwich than a physically confirmed artifact. We see it everywhere in Egyptian art, worn by pharaohs standing proudly before gods, smiting enemies, or doing absolutely nothing with immense gravitas. But again, we've never found a real one. Not a single double crown in any tomb, museum, or cursed tomb-side gift shop. Were they made of materials that didn't survive? Leather? Reed? Gold melted down by later kings with less patience for symbolism? Or were they simply symbolic, conjured into being by the scribe's brush and the sculptor's chisel? Historians still argue whether the Shan was ever a wearable crown or merely a conceptual fusion depicted in royal reliefs, something the pharaoh wore only when his image was cast in stone or painted on papyrus scrolls. If you were the living god king of Egypt, after all, you might not want to deal with the logistics of balancing two awkward shapes on your head during every public appearance. Now, imagine yourself in a pharaoh's sandals. You've inherited a unified Egypt, but unity is fragile. The northern nobles still whisper about their old independence. The southern priests remind you daily that the gods prefer their temples. So, you switch crowns depending on the crowd. Headed to Budo in the north? Pop on the Deshret. Visiting Nekhen in the south? Better wear the Hedjet. It's a political costume change, a visual love letter to both ends of your realm. And when you're holding court in Memphis, right smack in the middle? You wear both because compromise is exhausting, and you might as well double down on symbolism. Some reliefs even depict pharaohs with one crown in hand and another on their head, like they couldn't decide whether it was a red crown day or a white crown kind of vibe. Other times, they're shown wearing the double crown, while flanked by personifications of Upper and Lower Egypt two goddesses, offering lilies and papyrus stalks, like floral sponsorship deals. Speaking of goddesses, the crowns weren't just political markers, they were associated with divine feminine figures. The Deshret was linked to Wajet, the cobra goddess of Lower Egypt, while the Hedjet was tied to Nekbet, the vulture goddess of Upper Egypt. These two ladies weren't exactly BFFs at first, but once Egypt unified, they started showing up together on everything from temple lintels to pharaohs' arm bracelets, often leaning over the king's shoulders like protective aunts at a family reunion. And then there's that royal cobraith ureascoiled and ready on the front of most crowns, spitting symbolic fire at anyone who dared to look funny at the throne. You, standing in the heat with your arms crossed and your eyes slightly droopy, wonder just how heavy all this symbolism must have been. Literally, if each region had its own crown, and those were stacked, merged, or swapped constantly, that's a lot of ceremonial millinery to keep track of. Add to that the fact that the crowns weren't simple accessories, they had to be ritually activated. It wasn't enough to plop one on and call it a day. Priests had to bless them. Incantations had to be chanted. Sometimes animals were sacrificed. You imagine trying to get ready in the morning, and your crown won't start until a choir sings and someone sprinkles goat's milk on your wig. Not exactly a quick commute to divine rulership. And the crowns weren't always friendly looking. The deshret, for example, has a looped, protruding wire that shoots up and curls forward, a strange design choice that some say symbolized a bee sting. Others claim was a stylized reed, and a few believe was a bug-deflecting antenna. Okay, that last one's not official, but admit it, it would have been practical. You stretch a little, imagining how hot it must have been under all those layers of cloth, gold, and divine expectation. Pharaohs had to embody unity, but unity, it turns out, is pretty high maintenance. And yet, the visual vocabulary of the crowns worked. They reminded everyone from high priest to barley farmer that the land was whole, that chaos had been conquered, that even if the Nile didn't flood just right this year, the pharaoh's headwear had things under control. Or at least, it looked like it did. You let your gaze wander across the horizon, where the sun sets in a golden shimmer across fields of emmer wheat. Somewhere, a scribe dips his reed pen and sketches the new king crown, perfectly balanced, posture unnaturally rigid, staring into eternity with the blank serenity of someone who's worn too many hats for one lifetime. The crowns might not survive in our museums, but in art, in stone, and in the collective memory of a civilization that lasted over 3,000 years, their outlines remain. Tall, curved, awkward, majestic. A daily reminder that even gods in human form couldn't make do with just one hat. You're still lingering beside that dusty stone causeway, basking in the afterglow of ceremonial overkill. A gentle breeze stirs the papyrus reeds along the riverbank, and for a brief moment, you think you can hear the hiss of something small and serpentine sliding behind your thoughts. You blink, and suddenly you're staring straight into the glare of a golden cobra perched squarely on a pharaoh's forehead. Tonight, we're talking about the strangest accessory in ancient Egyptian head, Hearth Uraeus, that coiled, rearing cobra goddess that refused to stay off a crown. She's everywhere. On helmets, on headdresses, on jewelry. She's even wrapped into royal kilts, if you can believe it. And no, she's not just there for show. The Uraeus is Wadjet, a protective deity, a blazing solar symbol, and essentially the world's most judgmental security system. You stare into her tiny gold eyes. She stares back. But let's rewind a moment. The Uraeus didn't start as a fashion statement. She was a sign that the pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was a living god. Specifically, the son of Ra, the sun god. Wadjet, the cobra, was said to spit fire at Egypt's enemies, literal fire, out of her mouth. As a forehead ornament, kind of makes your car's anti-theft system feel underwhelming, doesn't it? The crown that made the Uraeus famous wasn't even a crown in the traditional sense. You've probably seen it 100 times. The Nemes headcloth, the striped blue and gold linen piece that drapes over the shoulders and looks suspiciously like a picnic blanket tucked around a lampshade. That's the one worn by Tutankhamun in his famous golden death mask. It's not a battle crown. It's not a temple crown. It's more of a royal casuala. Yes, I am lounging but still divine kind of look. And yet, on top of that humble linen piece, you guessed it, the Uraeus. Because what's a god king without a viper ready to vaporize your enemies? Now, the Nemes wasn't just about style, it sent a message. It was meant to evoke order, stability, the serene power of a king who doesn't need to shout. The stripes represent duality, upper and lower Egypt, day and night, chaos and order. You wear the Nemes when you want to signal that everything is under control, including your emotions, your taxes, and probably your eyeliner. You stand there, looking at the sun-bleached stone of a temple wall, where a carving of Ramses II glowers at eternity in his Nemes, And you wonder, did these things actually exist outside the artwork? Historians still argue whether the Nemes was a real everyday garment or something reserved for rituals and statues. Some believe the linen cloth was worn regularly by pharaohs, much like how a modern monarch might wear a crown once a year, but a tailored suit every day. Others suspect the Nemes might have only existed in symbolic or artistic form, a visual trope that said, "This man, he rules." And if we're being honest, the Nemes had a practical side. Egypt was hot, like staggeringly, eye-watering hot. A linen cloth covering your bald royal head was probably less of a regal affectation and more of a sunscreen with stripes. Add in some beads or a gold band to weigh the fabric down, and voila, you've got yourself a breathable, fashionable, cobra-enhanced monarch look. But of course, even the Nemes had competition. Sometimes, it got paired with other crown elements, because why stop at one headpiece when you could layer like you're in a divine fashion catalog? You'll find carvings of pharaohs wearing the Nemes with the double crown perched right on top, as if to say, "Yes, I am wearing two kingdoms and a snake. Thanks for noticing." And speaking of snakes, Wadjet wasn't alone up there. Later periods often paired her with Nekhbet, the vulture goddess of Upper Egypt. So if you're picturing a cobra and a vulture sitting side by side on a guy's forehead like mismatched dashboard bobbleheads, you're not far off. It's symbolic unity, yes, but also possibly the origin of ancient Egypt's version of doing the most. Now, let's imagine the scene. You're standing outside Karnak Temple during a festival. The pharaoh is approaching, shaded by ostrich feather fans, surrounded by chanting priests, and flanked by dancers with sistrums. The crowd is hushed. Then he appears stoic, radiant, resplendent in his Nemes. The linen flutters slightly in the desert wind, the gold threads shimmering like sunrise on water. But it's the uraeus that holds everyone's attention. That snake, frozen mid-strike, watches the crowd as if daring anyone to blink disrespectfully. You squint closer. Is it gold? Is it copper? Some historians think urei. Yes, that's the plural. Might have been carved wood, overlaid with precious metals. Others argue they were sewn into the headcloth. A few fringe theorists suggest they were detachable, carried around like talismans, and clipped onto different crowns as needed. Because nothing says pharaonic efficiency like a snap-on snake. One royal relief shows Amenhotep III wearing not one but two urei, spiraling up opposite sides of his brow like twin warning signs. And then there's Tutankhamun's burial mask has not only the cobra of Wadjet, but also the vulture of Nekhbet, both poised above his brow like co-regents whispering celestial secrets. But remember, these aren't just accessories. The uraeus was believed to hold actual spiritual power. The cobra's gaze wasn't ornamental. It was a magical defense system, said to blind, burn, or outright disintegrate anyone who threatened the pharaoh. You picture a palace guard about to protest something, locking eyes with the uraeus, and immediately deciding to stay silent and start sweeping instead. Yet as powerful as it was, the uraeus had to be activated through ritual. The priests performed special rites to awaken Wadjet's protective fire, sometimes involving incense, chants, or even animal offerings. Without this activation, the crown was just gold and linen. With it, you were essentially walking around with a solar-charged security system strapped to your head. And even more curious? Not every king wore the uraeus. During the Amarna period, good old heretic Pharaoh Akhenaten broke tradition by minimizing the use of snake symbology. He was too busy worshipping the sun disk Aten and posing with his children in strangely affectionate family portraits to bother with traditional cobra drama. His reign marked a brief stylistic shift, but like most unpopular fashion trends, it didn't last. You turn back to the wall. A cartouche glows faintly in the fading sunlight, encircling the throne name of a long-forgotten king. His face has been chiseled, away erased by time or politics. But the uraeus remains, still proud, still coiled, still daring you to forget what she represents. As the temple shadows stretch longer across the sand, you start to feel the weight of it all. The layers of symbolism, the whispers of divine fire, the subtle warning embedded in every golden snake. Crowns weren't just declarations, they were magical contracts. Power made visible, faith made wearable. And in this strange, slow parade of linen and feathers, cobras and vulture wings, you realize Egyptian pharaohs didn't just rule by decree, they ruled by design. You step away from the temple wall, its stone surface still warm from the sun, and follow the sound of chanting toward the inner sanctum where pharaohs are reborn as gods and style choices get even stranger. Because tonight, your sleepy eyes are going to be treated to a parade of crowns that may or may not have existed at all. Enter the world of ceremonial headgear that was probably too elaborate to ever wear in real life. The most famous of these is the hepresh, the so-called blue crown, sometimes called the war crown. But honestly, it looks like a cross between a beehive helmet and a very fancy colander. You've seen it in countless paintings, bright blue, covered in tiny golden studs or discs, fitted snugly to the royal head like some divine cycle helmet. But here's the mystery. Not one single hepresh has ever been found. Not in a tomb. Not in a forgotten storeroom. Not even as a tiny model on a statue. There are only depictions, wall art, reliefs, statuary, nothing physical, just the idea of it. Some scholars wonder if it was real at all. Perhaps a painted leather cap, a symbolic rendering, or a visual metaphor that somehow got mistaken for a literal hat. Historians still argue whether the hepresh was ever actually worn or was simply a ritual icon used to convey authority, military might, or divine alignment. Some Egyptologists suspect it was meant to represent the pharaoh as Horus the Avenger, shining like the sun, radiating power. Others suggest it was just easier to paint a neat blue crown than render an intricate names on every temple wall. But let's say it was real. You imagine it being stitched by royal craftsmen out of dyed leather, each disc sewn on by candlelight, the scent of goat hide and resin thick in the air. Maybe it had a linen lining to keep the heat off your scalp. Maybe it had to be blessed by priests and sprinkled with sacred water before use. Or maybe, and this is truly possible, it was the ancient equivalent of Photoshop, something added by scribes and artists to signal king doing something important here. One thing we do know is that the hepresh appears mostly in scenes of battle or royal ceremonies. You never see the pharaoh plowing fields or inspecting granaries in it. No, the hepresh is for when things get epic. Charging into combat? Blue crown. Speaking with the gods at the temple of Ptah? Blue crown. Reviewing troops on the edge of Nubia with one eye on a rebellion and the other on the harvest? Better believe it's hepresh time. You shift your weight onto a worn sandstone step and recall one of the most famous examples, Ramses the Eyes, him again shown in colossal reliefs at Abu Simbel, smiting enemies left and right while wearing the blue crown like it was glued to his skull. It's the action hat. The no-nonsense, let's do this symbol of kingly resolve. But then again, consider this. Ancient Egyptians were not known for doing things halfway. If they wanted to symbolize military authority, they'd build a 10-meter wall carving, then color it in with mineral pigments, then inscribe it with hieroglyphs that say, "This is definitely what happened, do not question it." The crown might not have needed to physically exist if it existed in the realm of myth, symbolism, and state propaganda. In a way, that made it more powerful, And the Khepresh isn't alone in this ghostly lineup. There are other crowns, some mentioned in texts, others only shown on deities, some so intricate they could never have been balanced on a real human head. There's the Atef crown, for instance. A tall white crown with ostrich feathers sticking out on both sides like celestial earmuffs. Often associated with Osiris, the god of the dead, it makes an occasional guest appearance on living pharaohs during certain rituals. And sure, you could try to build one of those out of reeds and feathers, but good luck keeping it upright in a desert breeze. Then there's the Hemmem crown, which is just pure excess. Picture this. 3 Atef-like structures stacked together. Spiraling horns, corkscrew adornments, cobras, sun discs, and about 5 feet of vertical symbolism. It's the crown version of a 6-tier wedding cake. You don't wear it to walk around. You wear it when you want the gods to notice. Maybe, because honestly, it's hard to say whether anyone ever wore this monstrosity at all. And yet, these impossible crowns show up in reliefs, on temple walls, in sacred art over and over. Always perched on serene, still pharaohs with perfect posture and no hint of neck strain. The crown is less an object, more a visual exclamation point. A way of saying, this moment is sacred. This ruler is more than flesh. This story is true because it looks this grand. And they knew we'd be watching. They knew their art would outlast their bones, that we'd be squinting at sun-worn glyphs 5,000 years later, asking ourselves whether these crowns were ever real or always just beautifully imagined. It's not unlike a modern logo, really. You don't have to touch it to know what it means. The golden arches don't have to be edible. A superhero's mask doesn't have to be practical. Sometimes, a symbol is more powerful than the object it's based on. You sit down on a smooth ledge, eyes drifting skyward, and wonder what these crowns meant to the ordinary people of Egypt, the fishermen, the farmers, the scribes with sore backs and ink-stained fingers. Did they believe their king actually wore all this stuff? Or did they nod politely, knowing it was all just theater? Beautiful divine theater with snakes, feathers, and just enough blue pigment to catch the god's attention. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. The pharaoh wasn't one man. He was many. Warrior, priest, judge, star watcher, builder, god. And each of those roles needed its own crown, its own language, its own visual cue to say, today, I am this. Which is why no pharaoh wore the same crown twice. Not because they were indecisive, but because they were performing a cosmic role play, shifting masks to keep the world in balance. And as the night deepens and the breeze cools your skin, you begin to see it. Not a crown, but a rotating carousel of meaning, spinning endlessly on the head of history. The temple shadows melt into the rising stars above you, and as the desert wind brushes softly past your cheek, you catch the faintest scent of something sweet and smoky incense, maybe, or perfume. And just like that, your sleepy imagination slides sideways into one of the strangest chapters of Egyptian fashion, the royal obsession with wigs, bald heads, and cones of perfumed wax slowly melting on people's scalps. Yes, this is still a story about crowns, but tonight, you're going to understand what really sat under all those glorious headpieces. And spoiler alert, it wasn't a head of hair. Picture yourself waking up as a mid-level noble in the 18th dynasty. You stretch, yawn, and immediately reach for your razor. Because everyone, from slaves to scribes to the mighty pharaoh himself, is expected to shave their heads. Clean, no stubble, no rebellion. Hair, after all, is for foreigners, for chaos, for people who let their emotions and lice get the better of them. An Egyptian scalp was a symbol of order, smooth, obedient, sunburned. Even the pharaoh, ruler of 2 lands, walked around looking like a very tan cue ball. The only exception? Wigs. Elaborate, braided, oiled, and sometimes extravagantly accessorized wigs. Now, this might sound hot, and not in the fun way, but wigs served multiple purposes. They protected bald heads from the merciless sun. They signaled wealth and class. More braids meant more status. And most importantly for tonight's tale, they provided a base for headgear. You try balancing a golden vulture and sun disk crown on a sweaty scalp with no hair grip. Disaster. But on a thick wig woven with linen threads? Stable. Regal. Less risk of your divinity toppling off mid-ceremony. Some pharaohs had multiple wigs for different events. There were court wigs, hunting wigs, festival wigs, probably even, I'm just checking in on grain storage wigs. These were often made of human hair, occasionally yak, sometimes palm fiber. The best ones were laced with gold thread, lapis beads, and precious stones. You imagine slipping one on. It's heavier than you thought, smells faintly of incense. And wait, what's that sticky spot? Oh yes, the wax cone. Now we're talking about one of the stranger rituals in ancient Egyptian beauty. Scented cones of wax, worn on top of the head during feasts and celebrations. Made of animal fat or beeswax and infused with myrrh, cinnamon, or lotus, these cones were placed atop wigs and allowed to slowly melt as the evening progressed. The idea was both aesthetic and aromatic. You looked festive and smelled amazing. And by the time the final hymn was sung or the last harp string plucked, your shoulders would be glistening with oily perfume. Messy? Sure. But elegant in its own melty way. Of course, the pharaoh's cones were next level. Bigger. Fancier. Symbolic. They might have included sacred oils meant to sanctify the body or attract divine favor. Some depictions even show the wax cone beneath a ceremonial headdress. You can't help but wonder, did the sacred headpiece ever slip sideways from the slow creep of perfumed grease? Did a priest ever pretend not to notice as his king's cobra tilted lazily to the left? Historians still debate whether these cones were ever worn in real life. Most of what we know comes from tomb paintings, where artists often took liberties for symbolic clarity. Maybe the cones were real. Maybe they were visual metaphors for spiritual purification. But honestly, after spending an hour beneath a crown under the Egyptian sun, a nice-smelling drip of lotus wax might have felt like a blessing from the gods. Let's not forget the practical concerns. A pharaoh's scalp needed to be protected both from sunstroke and from supernatural interference. That's why many wigs were lined with charms, amulets, stitched beneath the weave, prayers whispered as the hair was sewn. Wearing a wig wasn't just about fashion, it was about spiritual shielding. No one wants to get cursed through the top of their head. And the whole hairlessness thing? It extended to eyebrows too. Clean-shaven faces were the norm. Even the iconic false beard of pharaohs braided, tied on with strings, and shaped like a crescent moon wasn't actual facial hair. It was more of a chin crown, especially important for female pharaohs like Hatshepsut, who wore hers with a kind of royal defiance, saying, "Yes, I am woman. Hear me roar, and also, behold my majestic chin accessory." So you're lying back now, imagining your bald royal scalp, a slightly itchy wig made of lapis-studded palm fiber, a warm cone of perfume melting down your temples, and on top of it all, a crown. Maybe the white crown, maybe the double crown, maybe the war-ready shepresh. Each one requiring a slightly different head fit, a slightly different ceremonial purpose, a slightly different attitude. And yet, each crown starts the same way. On a shaved head, covered by a carefully fitted wig, blessed with scent, and braced with ritual. Because Egyptian kingship wasn't a job you just walked into. It was a full-body transformation, a cosmetic campaign, a spiritual layering process that began the moment you picked your morning headdress and ended with divine approval or heat exhaustion. There's something oddly comforting about it, though. The thoroughness, the pageantry, the sense that even if the Nile didn't rise and the stars shifted from their usual places, as long as the pharaoh wore the right crown, over the right wig, under the right wax cone, everything would probably be okay. And so you drift a little deeper, lulled by the thought of scented braids and sacred scalp rituals, understanding now that the crown was never just the top layer, it was the final chapter in a carefully orchestrated symphony of royal presentation. And under it all was just a bald, sleepy man trying to keep his kingdom together, one awkward headdress at a time. You find yourself now deep within the palace, complex past the columns, beyond the courtyards, and into the heart of a place where even the air feels like it's been blessed. The torches flicker low, and the scent of myrrh has thickened into something almost solid. You've reached the inner sanctuary of royal image-making. The chamber where Pharaoh Thutmose III's ego, ambition, and crown collection are carved literally into stone. This, you're told in a hushed voice, is where the king kept his symbolic closet. Not of tunics or sandals, of crowns. To be fair, closet might be generous. What you're really staring at is a wall massive and meticulously engraved with rows upon rows of reliefs, each showing the king in a different outfit, in a different pose, under the approving gaze of a different god, and crucially, in a different headdress. Over 60 depictions of Thutmose III, all in one hall. No repeats, no outfit recycling, no phoning it in with yesterday's crown. This king, he came prepared. Thutmose III reigned in the 15th century BCE and is often called the Napoleon of Egypt. But only if Napoleon had been obsessed with outfit coordination and divine pageantry. He didn't just fight battle, she performed kingship. And part of that performance involved wearing the right crown, in the right context, in front of the right deity. You squint at a carving of the king, presenting an offering to the falcon god Horus. His crown here is streamlined, tall, adorned with two feathers that spiral upward like caffeinated reeds. A few feet over, he's shown bowing before Amun-Rathi's time, in a crown with ram's horns, sun discs, and a fringe of cobras that looks borderline aggressive. And next to that, he's depicted leading a cattle festival wearing what appears to be a papyrus crown topped with an actual bouquet. Historians still argue whether these many crowns were real, metaphorical, or exaggerated. Did Thutmose really own all of these? Or were they visual prayer-artistic shorthand for divine approval? Some Egyptologists think these images weren't meant to be taken literally. Rather, they functioned like a royal resume. Here is everything I represent. Here's the hat I would wear if I were performing this ritual. Imagine applying for a job and listing every possible outfit you might wear for every possible meeting, each tied to a different aspect of your personality. You wander along the wall, tracing the changing crowns with your eyes. Some are variations on old classics, modest tweaks to the double crown, or slight additions to the nemes. Others seem entirely unique. One appears to be shaped like an open lotus. Another has bull's horns cradling a solar disk, possibly borrowed from Hathor. Yet another features an entire miniature shrine resting delicately atop the king's head, because apparently subtlety was not in fashion. A nearby relief shows Thutmose wielding a mace, his face locked in serene authority, and his crown flaring out in spirals, topped with tiny feathers that somehow don't look ridiculous, though. You imagine they might have caught the wind like sails if worn outside. The sheer variety is dizzying. And that's the point. This was no accident. In the world of pharaohs, repetition was laziness. Each crown, told a story. Each variation was a specific invocation. May Amun grant me strength. May Hathor bless this offering. May Ra burn my enemies and also keep my wig from slipping. And here's the thing. Thutmose wasn't just being extra, he was managing an empire. Egypt at this point had expanded its borders far beyond the Nile. It was multicultural, multilingual, and multi-layered in its theology. A single visual identity wouldn't cut it. When visiting Thebes, you wore a certain crown. In Heliopolis, different crown. Inspecting troops in Nubia, break out the Hipresh. Standing before the gods in Karnak, go for the feathered lotus halo and say a little prayer that you don't sneeze. One particular crown appears 3 times on this wall. A tall, conical white shape rimmed in gold and topped with what might be 2 cobras and a sun disk. Scholars aren't sure if this is a unique crown or a stylized variant. Some argue it was made from reeds and stiffened linen. Others suggest it was purely ceremonial, perhaps worn only during the Sed Festivala, sort of pharaonic jubilee, where kings proved they still had the spiritual and physical chops to rule. Part religious marathon, part royal rebranding. You sit for a moment on a low stone bench carved with offering list baskets of bread, jugs of beer, ox leg sand. Watch the flickering torchlight dance across the crown relief wall. It occurs to you that Thutmose might have known exactly what he was doing. These weren't just artistic flourishes. They were political theater, carefully directed. And in a culture where the spoken word created reality, the image was even more powerful. To depict something was to invoke it. To be shown wearing a crown was, in effect, to wear it forwretched into eternity, broadcast across the ages to anyone who could still read the story. There's a small, easily missed panel tucked near the far corner of the room. It shows Thutmose III not in a triumphant pose, but kneeling humble, hands outstretched, his crown smaller than the others, a simple band with an Ankh symbol on the brow. It's quiet, almost reverent, and yet it feels like the most powerful one of all. Because it says, I serve the gods, I wear their will, and in return, they lend me their crowns. You smile. Even gods need good stylists. You move deeper into the painted hush of the palace corridors, and suddenly, the walls begin to shift. The reliefs start to change shape, curve in new directions, take on unfamiliar faces. There are still gods, still crowns, but now one of those faces looks different. Strong jaw, wide eyes. Yes, but softer, more refined, more feminine. Welcome to the reign of Hatshepsut the Pharaoh, who not only shattered expectations, but also raided the crown closet like it was an all-you-can-wear buffet. Hatshepsut wasn't the first woman to wield power in Egypt, but she was the first to do it so completely, so unapologetically, and with such full commitment to the role of king that she made sure every statue, relief, and temple inscription addressed her accordingly. As Pharaoh, not queen, not consort. Pharaoh, and that meant, you guessed it, she wore the beard. You step into a sunlit court within her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, where a breeze lifts the scent of wild desert herbs and dust, and columns rise like papyrus stalks into the sky. Everywhere you look, there are images of Hatshepsut demure, not seated beside a male ruler, but standing tall, walking like a man, offering to the gods, smiting enemies, and above all, crowned in the full regalia of kingship. But here's where it gets wild. She's shown wearing every crown. All of them. Not just once. Often, all in the same temple wall series. Here she is, in the white crown of Upper Egypt. The Hedjet. A few meters down, she switched into the red crown of Lower Egypt. the deshret. Then, boom, the double crown, the shent. Then the nemes, draped around her smooth, painted cheeks, her face stoic and androgynous. And then, that royal false beard braided, hooked to the ears, stiff as a staff of command. No detail spotted. Why the excess? Why the total costume immersion? Because Hatshepsut knew the rules of the game, and she played them better than most men ever had. Egyptian culture had specific expectations about what a pharaoh looked like, how they moved, how they dressed. Hatshepsut could have ruled as a queen regent. She could have stood behind the throne, whispering into a young nephew's ear, but instead, she stepped forward, cleared her throat, and said, "I'll take the lot." Historians still argue whether her self-presentation was political genius, personal ambition, or simply survival in a system that couldn't imagine a woman as divine ruler without seeing her in a man's silhouette. Was she subverting the system or perfectly playing along with it? You lean in closer to one of the painted reliefs. Her figure has been sculpted with slightly broadened shoulders, a squared jawline, not masculine exactly, but certainly idealized. She's not trying to fool anyone into thinking she's a man. There's no historical record of Hatshepsut pretending not to be a woman. But her image tells a different story. And in the language of symbols, clothing is story. Crowns, especially. Every crown Hatshepsut wore told a specific part of the tale she needed to sell. I am the rightful heir. White crown. I rule both lands. Double crown. I am guided by the gods. Eight of crown. I am divine myself. Nemes with Uraeus. I can defend Egypt. Keprish, the blue crown of power. And the beard? That was the final exclamation point. Because in ancient Egypt, the false beard was less about gender and more about divine association. Gods had beards. Kings had beards. Ergo, a king who was also a god must wear the bear divan if, underneath, she was completely smooth-cheeked and, frankly, over the whole patriarchal thing. You try to imagine the fitting room. A royal stylist holds up the fake beard, tilts their head, says, "Turn slightly left, Majesty." Yes, that's it. Very Osiris. It wasn't just for show. Each appearance in each crown reinforced her legitimacy. Remember, Egypt didn't use elections. It used divine symbols. You didn't win support with speeches, you wore it. And Hatshepsut wore hers like a goddess with a budget. There's a particularly famous statue from Karnak Temple where she kneels, offering jars to Amun, wearing the nemes and that classic serene expression, half smile, half eternity. The cobra curls at her brow. The beard juts forward in perfect symmetry. It's stunning. And it's a message. I am here. I am Pharaoh. You will not erase me. Spoiler, they tried anyway. After her death, her stepson and successor, Thutmose III, very crown-happy king from earlier, systematically chiseled her name and image off monuments. Statues smashed, cartouches erased, her narrative buried. Historians still debate whether this was personal vengeance, political necessity, or an attempt to reset the gender balance in the divine order of succession. Whatever the reason, it failed. Because centuries later, archaeologists put the pieces back together. And today, you're sitting here, wrapped in moonlight and incense, learning her name and her crowns. Hatshepsut didn't just inherit power, she embodied it. She wore the crowns better than many men who came before her. And more importantly, she made sure they were recorded carefully, publicly, permanently. Even if the statues were broken, the images still hum with presence. You close your eyes and see her again, not striding or commanding now, but calm, quiet, a crown on her brow, the desert wind lifting her robe, and the stars above slowly turning, as if even the cosmos paused to take notice. You wander back through the temple halls, your sandals scuffing against the limestone floor, and before long, you're caught in another kind of procession with drums, slow chants, veiled dancers, and a lot of incense that seems determined to coat your lungs from the inside out. There's a different kind of crown on display here, and it isn't about ruling from a throne. This one belongs to the journey from life to death, from king to memory. You've stumbled into a royal funeral. And at the center of it all, carried on a golden litter beneath a canopy of ostrich feathers, is the body of a boy king whose name you already know, Tutankhamun, Tutankhamun, King Tut, the most famous pharaoh to modern Irsand. Not because he built great monuments or won sweeping battles, but because his tomb happened to escape the grand larceny that most others did not. In 1922, Howard Carter opened a door sealed for over 3,000 years and found a treasure trove of gold, linen, ritual items, and headgear galore. Tonight, we follow that parade of crowns into the tomb. You ease your way down the corridor, where painted walls flicker in torchlight. Priests murmur spells in ancient tongue, and the air is heavy with significance. Because even in death, a pharaoh did not go crownless. In fact, it may have been the most crown-filled moment of his existence. There's the golden mask, yes, the one you've seen 100 times, smooth and serene, with wide lapis-lined eyes and that haunting stillness. He wears the nemes there, the striped linen headdress immortalized in beaten gold, and right at the forehead, you see it again, the Uraeus cobra. But this time, it's doubled. Wadjet, the cobra goddess of Lower Egypt, and Nekbet, the vulture goddess of Upper Egypt, both perched side by side, guarding his passage to the afterlife. A duet of divinity on the brow. You wonder, why two protectors? Because in the afterlife, even gods can be territorial. And this king, barely a man when he died, needed all the backup he could get. But wait, there's more. Inside Tutankhamun's tomb were additional headdresses, some golden, some inlaid with faience and carnelian. One was a diadem, flexible and lined with textile, designed to be tied around the head. It was found wrapped around the mummy's linen-covered brow. Scholars debate whether this was a crown, a ritual band, or perhaps a final nod to Wraith sun god, whose daily death and rebirth mirrored the king's own. Another piece in the tomb appears to be ceremonial, more delicate, almost impractical. A vulture with outstretched wings, crafted in such detail that you half expect it to blink. Some say it's not a crown at all, but a neck piece. Others suggest it once perched on the head during temple rites and simply fell out of position in the centuries of collapse and dust. Historians still argue whether Tutankhamun's crowns were ever worn in life or made purely for burial. Some pieces show no sign of wear. Others seem crafted from older objects, reused gold, melted amulets, family heirlooms repurposed to give a teenager king the full weight of tradition, even in death. And then there's the question of overkill. Tutankhamun's tomb, while modest by royal standards, was packed with regalia. Why so many crowns? Because death wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the king's role as Osiris, the god of the afterlife. And that job came with a dress code. Crown of Osiris? Check. Crown of Ra for the morning boat ride across the sky? Check. Crown of Amun for temple introductions? Also check. Crown with lotus buds and papyrus fronds for reminding everyone you're still king of both lands? Yes, please. You imagine the priests ticking boxes off a checklist. Did we pack the double crown? The snake? The vulture? What about the festival wig? One priest stops mid-chant and mutters, "Should have labeled these things." You smirk. Even in ancient Egypt, packing for eternity sounds stressful. But here's where it gets quietly profound. Every crown in that tomb wasn't just a fashion piece, it was a compass. Each one pointed the pharaoh toward a different facet of the cosmos, toward different gods, different roles, different responsibilities. They were tools for the afterlife, not ornaments. Crowns weren't worn for applause. They were worn to navigate eternity. You picture Tutankhamun in the afterlife, walking slowly through the fields of reeds. He sees Osiris, seated on his throne of judgment. What does he do? He changes his crown, switches from the Nemes to the Atef, from ruler of Egypt to brother of the gods. Then he sees Ra approaching in his solar boat. Another change. The sun disk crown now, radiant with divine fire. And on it goes, moment to moment, crown to crown, each one transforming him, aligning him with the stars, the elements, the endless unfolding of the cosmos. And what's most incredible? Despite all the art, all the gilded splendor, not one of those crowns survived perfectly intact. They were melted, chipped, buried, broken. Only the golden mask remains truly whole. Even in his triumph over time, Tutankhamun's crowns remind us that material fades, but the image endures. You lie back and watch as the funeral procession fades into dust, the drums falling quiet, the torches flickering out. The crown rests now, not on a brow, but in your memoriam echo of gold, a whisper of gods, a silent assurance that even the briefest rain can leave behind a glint of eternity. The sun has long set over the dunes, and your footsteps now echo along a colder pathone that winds through the ruins of temples and forgotten archives, past looted tombs and weathered inscriptions. You're no longer walking through golden processions or perfumed coronations. Tonight, you're peering into shadow-sat the crowns that disappeared, and the ones we might have imagined entirely. Let's start with an uncomfortable fact. For all the fuss, pomp, and endless temple reliefs showing pharaohs in ornate headdresses, we have found almost none of the actual crowns. Not a double crown, not a war crown, not even a plain ceremonial cap sitting quietly in a dusty side chamber, waiting to say, surprise. Nothing. We found statues wearing crowns, paintings depicting crowns, texts describing crowns. But the real things? Gone. Vanished. Lost to time, sand, and perhaps something more intentional. This has led many historians to a strange conclusion. What if the most famous crowns of ancient Egypt weren't physical objects at all? What if they were purely symbolic, existing only in art and ritual, never actually strapped onto a real human skull? Now, that might sound absurd, but think about it. Crowns like the Shentha combined red and white crown would have been extremely difficult to construct. Two complex shapes, fused into one, often with a protruding spiral, a tight fit, and a cobra or two flaring out the front like they're auditioning for a magic show. Not exactly the kind of thing you wear to lunch, and yet they're everywhere in Egyptian imagery. The moment a pharaoh is shown performing anything sacred, offering to a god, smiting enemies, even just standing there looking vaguely powerful, there's the crown. Tall, regal, impossibly perfect. Historians still argue whether these super crowns were real wearable gear or something more like a visual halo. Some say they were stylized representations of more modest headdresses. Others think the artist just followed a strict symbolic script. Does it show authority? Then add the cobra. Add the feathers. Add the full crown buffet. No, don't ask if it makes sense, it's divine. You pause at the base of a shattered column and stare at a carving almost worn away by time. It's a pharaoh standing beside a god, both with crowns so tall, so layered, they look like they'd snap a mortal's neck. Could anyone really have worn these? Or were they meant to be spiritual costumes, expressions of divine status, rather than practical garments? In some tombs, especially those of lesser-known rulers or high priests, We find stelae that mention crown names we've never seen depicted. Crowns like the Sekemti or the Hemhem show up briefly in texts, only to vanish again without context. Some are described in religious texts like the Book of the Dead as tools for navigating the afterlife. Others pop up in hymns. "O crown of flames, protect me as I pass into light." Sounds impressive, but what was it? And then there are the mystery crown hints, buried in poetry, priestly liturgies, or inscriptions where a single hieroglyph stands in for an entire visual concept. One crown is described as woven from stars. Another is said to be coated in night. These aren't accessories. These are metaphors with a PR budget. You imagine an ancient Egyptian poet leaning over a scroll, muttering, "Crown made of flowers? Number crown made of moonlight? Yes, that'll make the gods take notice." The result? A crown that never existed, but was spoken of for centuries. Even the known crowns, like the Shepresh or the Atef, were often depicted in ways that changed across dynasties. What was tall and feathered in one period became flatter and curled in another. Sometimes the same crown was shown with sun discs, sometimes without. What was the rule? Apparently, make it fabulous and vaguely intimidating. It gets more confusing. Some pharaohs, like Akhenaten, a religious reformer with a penchant for solar worship, an elongated skull sapphire in almost cartoonish crowns that no one else ever wore. Thin, vertical cones with odd flares, like stretched teardrops on a windblown day. Were they real? Or was Akhenaten ever the radical, commissioning headgear straight from the avant-garde section of divine couture? You lean into the thought, maybe Egypt's crown game wasn't just ceremonial, it was competitive. A way for each ruler to say, "Yes, I'm the sun god's favorite. No, your spiral is not as golden as mine." Or perhaps there's a simpler truth. Crowns were ephemeral, made of reed, linen, leather, coated in gold foil, or painted with crushed minerals, the kind of materials that don't survive 3 millennia of humidity, tomb raiders, and time. Just because we haven't found them doesn't mean they weren't worn. Maybe they were too sacred to be buried with, passed from king to king, hidden in temples that were later looted, burned, or buried beneath centuries of shifting Nile silt. It's also possible they were destroyed on purpose. Ancient Egypt took transition seriously. When a pharaoh died, his regalia was often sealed away, ritually killed, to sever his connection to the mortal world. Crowns might have been burned, dismantled, or offered to the gods in hidden rites. You don't want someone wearing your power after you've moved on to the afterlife, do you? You sit on a crumbled block of sandstone, moonlight tracing the edge of your sleeve, and let the mystery settle around you like sand. The image of a crown is clearer than its substance. Maybe that's how the pharaohs wanted it. Maybe the point wasn't the crown itself, but what people believed about the one who wore it. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most powerful crown of all. The one that never had to exist, because it lived forever in stone, story, and the quiet awe of a world that still remembers. The wind rises as you leave the open temple courts behind, drawn now into the deepening quiet of ancient alleyway salleys without footprints, roads that haven't felt sandals in millennia. Somewhere behind these walls, beneath lintels no longer whole, is where the invisible artisans once worked. You're here to find the crownsmiths. If pharaohs wore crown sand by now, you've followed their every twist, stripe, coil, and spiral. Someone had to make them. Someone had to weave the reeds, hammer the gold, inlay the turquoise, bind the leather. Right? And yet, here's the strange thing. We have no clear record of any profession in ancient Egypt dedicated solely to making crowns. There are titles for wig makers, jewelry artisans, sculptors, stonecutters, even sandal designers. Yes, those existed. But crownsmiths? Nothing direct. No inscription that says, "Hi, I'm Ketty, royal crafter of headwear for divine overlords." Historians still argue whether crown making was a specialized craft or simply a shared responsibility among temple artisans. One theory suggests the crowns weren't made in the royal palace at all, but in sacred workshops deep inside temple precincts, controlled by high priests and guarded like state secrets. Imagine the setting: a dark, incense-filled chamber lit by flickering oil lamps. In the corner, a low wooden table. On it, a half-formed uraeus glints, its golden coils not yet ready to spit fire in the name of Wajet. Around it, artisans murmur prayers as they work, because this isn't just metalwork, it's spiritual architecture. A crown isn't complete until it's been ritually awakened. Some believe the most sacred crowns were never even touched by human hands after creation. Once finished, they were wrapped in linen, stored in temple vaults, and only brought out during special festivals, placed on the pharaoh's head not by a servant, but by the god's own priester, in theory, the god's symbolic hand. Crowned, not in ceremony, but in divinity. You duck beneath a low doorway and enter what remains of one such workshop. There's not much left, just faint traces on the walls, a few worn hieroglyphs, a discarded stone palette. But imagine it as it once was, full of sacred noise, the clang of bronze chisels, the hiss of pigment against plaster, the scent of cedar oil. Somewhere in the corner, a half-formed crown sits waiting, its edges soft with gold leaf, its spine reinforced with woven palm. But what were these crowns made of? Not gold, not always. Despite the glittering associations we have from Tutankhamun's tomb, most ceremonial crowns were likely crafted from perishable materials. Linen, wicker, animal hide, coated with plaster, painted with crushed malachite, lapis, or cinnabar. Lightweight, flexible, and importantly sacred. That also means they didn't survive. A 3,000-year-old leather crown doesn't last unless it's buried in perfect bone-dry conditions. And even then, fire, moisture, looters, and time can erase all evidence. You pass a wall niche that might have once held a headdress, just a square of shadow now. You wonder who stood here centuries ago, carefully wrapping the hedget in ceremonial cloth. Was it passed from one ruler to another? Or burned in an end-of-reign rite so it couldn't be misused? Some theories suggest each crown had a lifespan only once per ritual cycle, then ritually retired. Which would mean the priests weren't just crown makers, they were crown barriers, part of a quiet, unseen rhythm of renewal. But not every crown was ceremonial. Some were pragmatic. Wigs reinforced with linen strips, festival headbands dotted with glass beads, reed crowns made for harvest ceremonies, worn only once and then discarded. Those wouldn't have been stored with reverence, they'd have been tossed with the post-party cleanup, swept into the dust with lotus petals and wine jugs. And then there's the crown, as a magical object. In the pyramid texts, the earliest known religious texts of ancient Egypt, crowns are not described as hats. They're described as forces. The white crown seizes the enemies of the king. The red crown destroys the rebellious. The double crown unites the gods above and below. They're practically characters, living, breathing extensions of royal will, which might explain why no crownsmiths are listed. Maybe the crown was never considered a product, but a being, something summoned into existence through ritual and image, rather than forged with hammers and twine. That's why in temples like Karnak or Edfu, you'll see elaborate scenes of crowns being offered by gods to the king, not the other way around. Horus presents the red crown, Nekhbet presents the white. The gods don't just approve of the pharaoh's power, they deliver it. Headgear included. You stand now at the center of a forgotten courtyard, open to the stars. Somewhere out there, Orion moves across the sky, the same way he did when crown makers and priests were alive. You imagine them whispering, "This feather must face east. This serpent must hiss west. This gold must reflect the sunrise exactly 3 times." The work of crafting crowns wasn't manual. It was mystical choreography, which brings us to one last, strange possibility. Some scholars argue that the physical crown didn't matter, only its depiction, that the real crown was the image, the wall carving, the statue in the sanctuary, that no pharaoh needed to wear it, so long as people saw it, as long as the gods recognized it. And maybe that's why no crown-making guild existed, because there were no ordinary craftsmen, only caretakers of imagery, servants of illusion, storytellers in gold and pigment, whose work was never meant to survive the millennia, only to resonate through them. You close your eyes, and for a moment, you see them. The faceless artisans, the invisible crown makers, the ones who shaped divinity out of linen and reed, who painted serpents into stone, who gave the gods their hats and never signed their names. They are forgotten, but their crowns still shine. The scent of dust and old papyrus lingers in your nostrils as you move away from the silent workshops and into the open light again. The desert breeze has returned, whispering over sandstone and shadow, and for a moment, you feel it lifting something unseen like a curtain, or maybe the memory of a hymn long buried beneath sand and ceremony. Now, we turn our eyes to a more peculiar corner of pharaonic headwear. You've seen the battle crowns, the ceremonial ones, the funeral editions, and artistic flourishes. But did you know that there were crowns, yes, actual crowns designed for things like petting bulls, watching stars, or approving the opening of a new canal? Welcome to the world of ritual headgear. Not every crown was made for conquest. Some were created for cosmic alignment, agricultural blessing, or even, as some scholars suspect, for highly specific interactions with animals. A good pharaoh didn't just dress for power, he dressed for precision. You're standing now in the temple of Hathor at Dendera. The columns here are thick with carvings not of kings smiting enemies, but of rituals. The king is shown offering milk to the goddess. He wears a crown shaped like 2 cow horns curving around a solar disk. It's not just a symbol of Hathor, it's her literal headdress. And by wearing it, the pharaoh becomes the offering, the priest, and the recipient, all in one. That crown isn't about domination. It's about merging with a deity in a carefully choreographed act of celestial diplomacy. Elsewhere, in similar rituals, pharaohs wear crowns with stylized ram's horns, lotus flowers, and even bundles of grain. Each element a message. I am fertility. I am abundance. I am this very season's success. You chuckle a little, imagining a modern leader donning a giant hat made of wheat just to ensure the corn harvest arrives on time. But for the Egyptians, this wasn't eccentricity, it was Ma'at cosmic order, the belief that the pharaoh didn't just represent balance in the universe, he maintained it, and often by wearing the correct headpiece to dinner. There's a lesser-known festival called the Feast of the Valley, where the pharaoh would travel from Karnak to Luxor by bark, a kind of divine river cruise. He'd don a special crown just for that even-tone shaped, according to some depictions, like a blossoming papyrus stalk surrounded by feathers. Was it comfortable? Almost definitely not, but it said something clear. I connect the 2 sides of the Nile. I cross between life and death. I wear this hat, so the flood comes. And then there were the crowns for astronomical rites. You follow your thoughts up to the temple of Dendera again, where a ceiling fresco shows the night sky as the goddess Nut arched across the heavens, swallowing the sun each dusk and birthing it each dawn. During specific star alignments, particularly with Sirius, which heralded the Nile flood pharaohs, would stand in observatories or temple courts and wear a crown shaped like a solar disk, flanked by cobras. Why? Because the gods needed to see you. And more importantly, they needed to recognize you. Historians still argue whether these ritual crowns were worn outside of their specific ceremonies. Some suggest they were kept sealed in sanctuaries, unlocked only on holy days, and then placed upon the king's head for mere minutes, while priests chanted and incense curled toward the sky. Others believe the pharaoh wore them frequently daily, even as a living signal to the priesthood that time was passing correctly, that crops would ripen, that the stars were in place. You pause beside a wall relief that's unusually detailed. The pharaoh here is shown standing beside an Apis bull, sacred to Ptah. His crown? A curious combination of cow horns, a flaring sun disk, and what appears to be two stylized plants, maybe Persea trees. That crown doesn't show up in any other major festival. It seems to have been made just for this. Just for greeting a bull. You try to imagine it, walking up to a heavily perfumed, gold-draped bull with eyeliner thicker than yours, wearing a 10-pound floral crown, whispering prayers about harmony and fertility, all while trying not to trip on your own linen robe. But again, that's the point. Egyptian ritual wasn't designed for efficiency. It was designed for eternity. And eternity notices the details. There are even depictions rare, but telling of pharaohs wearing crowns shaped like obelisks. Not holding obelisks. Wearing them. Upright, pointed, architectural statements of solar power, balanced on a human head. Scholars don't know if these were ever constructed or simply depicted to suggest the king's alignment with the sun. But you wouldn't be surprised if, at some point, a priest said, "Yes, Your Majesty. That's a perfectly reasonable hat. Very tasteful. Yes, straight up with a granite spire of it." One of the most fascinating ceremonial headpieces appears during said festival's jubilees, held every 30 years to renew a pharaoh's power. Here, you find the pharaoh wearing a tight skull cap, often with two feathers attached like wings. This isn't the usual grand display. It's quiet, personal, a symbol of rebirth, of rejuvenation. Not about conquest, about continuation. And in that contrast, you find a truth. The Egyptian crown wasn't just a symbol of power. It was a calendar, a compass, a weather vane, a wardrobe for interacting with the divine, tailored to the season, the ritual, the relationship. You sit again, watching the breeze tug at a line of dust across the stone floor. The crowns for warfare are memorable, yes, but it's these smaller, stranger, deeply ritualistic ones that feel the most human. The ones worn not to show strength, but to ask for help. For rain. For peace. For safe passage through the stars. A papyrus-shaped crown for speaking to the Nile. A star-marked band for welcoming Sirius. A vulture-feathered headdress for anointing newborns. And all of it. Ephemeral. Gone now. Melted. Rotted. Swept away. But the meanings remain, baked into stone and story. You close your eyes and let the imagery swirl. Flowered crowns, solar discs, animal, shaped headpieces gently swaying as the pharaoh walks among his Pioplinot, a conqueror, but a conductor of the sacred. Because sometimes, even gods need to put on the right hat. You leave the temple behind, know its painted walls and feathered crowns, fading into the darkening sky, and find yourself walking along a dusty royal road. The torches here are fewer. The grandeur has slipped into silence, but something lingers in the air. A different sort of drama, because not every crown in Egypt was passed down peacefully. Some were stolen, claimed, redrawn, worn by men who never earned them, and torn away from kings who never gave them up. Tonight, we enter the era of enemies, rivals, and crown theft drama. It's easy to imagine ancient Egypt as timeless and stable. All those grand monuments, all those symmetrical rows of sphinxes, but Egyptian history was full of interruptions, upheavals, and awkward dynastic disputes that would make a modern soap opera blush. And, at the center of each power grab, the crown. You begin with a man named Cts, that's Set, the god of chaos, storms, and confusing family reunions. After Osiris, the symbolic good king, was murdered and dismembered, Set claimed the crown. Not in the nice, next in line kind of way. In the I threw my brother in the Nile and dared anyone to stop me kind of way. This myth set the tone for centuries of royal legitimacy. Whoever wore the crown had to earn it not just through bloodline, but through symbolism, which is why every usurper, rival, or upstart who clawed their way to the throne had to do one key thing: make the crown believable. Take Horemheb, for instance, a military general who became pharaoh after the death of Tutankhamun and his short-lived successors. Horemheb wasn't royal by blood, but he was clever. He commissioned monuments showing himself in full royal regalia, wearing the double crown, smiting enemies, flanked by gods, especially Horus, as if to say, "See, I'm chosen. I deserve the hat." Historians still argue whether Horemheb's rise was a return to order or a clever act of throne-jacking. But one thing's clear: his image was all about crowns. More than half of his surviving monuments are focused on legitimacy, which means hats, snakes, feathers repeat until the people forget who was king last week. You pause by a crumbling stele. The carving has been hacked away. The name scratched out. It's a scene of erasure, something ancient Egyptians took very seriously. To remove a king's name or image was to rob him of power. And often, it included removing his crown. Not just literally, but artistically. Take the case of Akhenaten, sun-worshipping heretic who upended everything. After his death, his successors went on a full-blown PR campaign. They chiseled away his strange, unique crown depictions. They erased the solar discs. They redrew old gods wearing the crowns he'd claimed as his own. And just like that, the wrong crown was banished from memory. But perhaps the pettiest crown drama of all belongs to the Third Intermediate Period. That's an actual term used by scholars. It was a time of chaos, civil war, and overlapping pharaohs. Sometimes there were 2, even 3 kings ruling at once, each with their own capital, their own gods, their own crowns. You imagine one ruler in Thebes donning the white crown, declaring himself Lord of Upper Egypt. Meanwhile, another upstart in Tanis slaps on the red crown and declares, "Actually, I'm king now." And in the middle, a poor scribe tasked with writing 2 different royal names on everything just in case. One particularly bold claimant was a Libyan noble named Shoshenq I, who married into royal blood and declared himself pharaoh in the 22nd dynasty. How did he assert his right? You guessed, Ith wore the full regalia, sponsored new crown imagery in temples, and built walls covered in scenes of him standing between Wajet and Nekbet, the cobra and the vulture, looking as Egyptian as possible. You lean against a broken pillar and think, how many crowns were redrawn over someone else's? How many divine endorsements were just well-placed limestone PR? Even within families, the crowns changed heads quickly. During the late New Kingdom, you had power struggles between brothers, sons, viziers, and occasionally ambitious queens. Some pharaohs even tried to preemptively crown their heirs as co-rulers, just to make sure the sacred hat didn't get snatched after their final breath. And then there's Ramses III, who survived more than one assassination attempt and a literal harem conspiracy against his life. What did his enemies want? His life. Yes, but more importantly, his status, the crown, the chance to wear it themselves, stand before a temple crowd, and say, "This is mine now." You catch your reflection in a sliver of polished stone. You're wearing no crown, and yet, you feel the weight of it, the constant pressure of having to prove it belongs on your head. Because in Egypt, a crown wasn't secure just because it sat on your brow. It had to be defended, not only from swords, but from memory. You imagine a scene. Two claimants stand before a temple gate. One wears the white crown, the other, the red. A priest squints at them, shrugs, and starts carving both names just in case the wrong guy wins. Practical, safe, awkward. And what about the crowns that changed shape depending on the ruler? Some pharaohs altered the height, width, or decoration of their crowns to distinguish themselves from their predecessors. A taller sun disk here, an extra cobra there. Not just fashion symbolic one-upmanship, you smirk. Ancient Egyptian kings, like modern politicians, knew the power of branding. The moon rises higher, casting long shadows across the ruins. You pass a wall where the profile of a forgotten king remains, but his crown has been chiseled away, a silent dethroning. And you think, the battle for the crown didn't end when someone put it on. It continued in stone, in paint, in every act of remembrance or erasure. Crowns were stolen, forged, borrowed, and rewritten, but never ignored. Because in a world ruled by symbols, the right to wear the crown was the right to write history. And sometimes, that meant stealing it first. The night deepens now, and the stars burn steadily overhead. But your journey isn't over, not quite. You follow the sound of sandals brushing stone through the edge of history, past the last native pharaohs, and toward a new figure on the horizon. He arrives not by bark, not on a throne carried by priests, but on horseback. His name is Alexander. And yes, that Alexander. Tonight, you'll see what happens when the crowns of Egypt fall into foreign handshow. They're reshaped, repurposed, and reimagined by conquerors who didn't speak the language, but knew exactly how to wear the symbols. Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BCE as a liberator. At least, that's what the locals were told. He defeated the Persian satraps who had ruled Egypt as a province, not a kingdom, and swept into Memphis with the flair of a man who knew how to make an entrance. He was young, charismatic, and notably very interested in Egyptian traditions. And so, before anyone had time to ask whether he understood hieroglyphs, he did the one thing that mattered most. He went to the temple of Amun at Siwa Oasis and got crowned. Not just any coronation, a sacred one, the kind that said, "I'm not just king, I'm divine." Historians still argue whether Alexander truly believed he was the son of Amun or whether he was just playing the role. But either way, the result was the same. He adopted the iconography. He donned the crown. Or more accurately, crowns. Egyptian reliefs from the period show him in all the classic styles: the Nemes headdress, the double crown, even the blue crown of war. His nose is unmistakably Greek, his stance slightly more Hellenistic, but the message is pure Pharaoh. I am the living Horus. I rule both lands. I wear the hat now. And the Egyptians? Many seemed fine with it. He didn't raise temples. He sponsored repairs. He built Alexandria, of course modest beginnings for what would become a cultural colossus. But he made a point of honoring their gods, wearing their crowns, and learning, or at least pretending to learn, their customs. The strange thing is, Alexander never returned to Egypt after that first visit. He died in Babylon, a world away, before the walls of Alexandria were even finished. But the legacy of his coronation lived on, because after Alexander came the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies, a Greek-speaking dynasty ruling Egypt for nearly 300 years, each one named either Ptolemy or Cleopatra, as if creativity had taken an extended vacation. They were outsiders, yes, but they understood the assignment. The early Ptolemies realized quickly that you couldn't rule Egypt with swords alone. You had to embrace the iconography. That meant participating in temple rituals, commissioning traditional reliefs, and yes, wearing the right crowns. So they did. Sort of. You're now standing in the Temple of Horus at Edfu, built under Ptolemaic rule. You look at the wall carvings. The king, Ptolemy VIII, maybe is shown in perfect profile. He wears the shent, the double crown, tall and idealized. He's offering incense to Horus, flanked by priests in leopard skins. The style is indistinguishable from earlier dynasties, except, if you squint, you'll notice the proportions are slightly off. The crown's curve is exaggerated. The king's hair peeks out where it shouldn't. And his features? Definitely Greek. You chuckle softly. It's cosplay. Really, really expensive cosplay. But again, it worked. The Egyptian priesthood accepted these foreign rulers in large part because they played the part convincingly. They wore the crowns, used the proper names, and referred to themselves in official inscriptions as beloved of Amun, son of Ra, lord of the two lands. Even as their court spoke Greek, and their army was staffed with Macedonian officers, the crown visually remained the same, tall, symbolic, rooted in traditions older than Homer. Some Ptolemies took the symbolism to creative heights. One version of the Atef crown used during Ptolemaic festivals featured double plumes and ram's horns and a sun disk and cobras, making the wearer look like a very ambitious fruit basket. But again, message received. I'm still the pharaoh. Look at my absurd hat. By the time you get to Cleopatra VIII, last of the line, the fusion of Greek and Egyptian imagery is nearly seamless. Coins show her in Hellenistic profile, hair tied back, features strong. But temple reliefs? There, she wears the vulture crown of Isis, sometimes the horned crown of Hathor, sometimes both. It's complicated. Cleopatra understood image better than anyone. Her reign was a balancing act between two worlds, Greek logic and Egyptian myth. When addressing Rome, she leaned into intellect. When speaking to Egyptians, she wore the crowns, all of them, together, if necessary. Historians still argue whether she truly embraced Egyptian religion or used it for political convenience. But once again, we're back to symbols. The crown didn't care where you were born. It only asked, "Can you wear me convincingly?" You sit quietly in the shadow of a column, the desert night pressing soft against your shoulders. Somewhere above, the constellations shift unchanged since the first kings carved their names into the earth. And you think of all the hands that passed that crown. From Narmer to Nefertiti, from Horemheb to Alexander, from Ptolemy to Cleopatra. Each one adding a layer, each one reshaping the crown just enough to say, "It's mine now." And it always was. And so the crown endures, even as Egypt's sovereignty fades, even as Rome approaches, ready to absorb the land, the gods, the symbols. The last real pharaoh is not Egyptian, but she wears the crowns anyway. Because in Egypt, the crown is older than any king, and once you wear it, it changes you. You rise now from the worn stone at Edfu, and walk slowly into the morning blue hush of history's final corridor. The torchlight has dimmed. The last pages of the Pharaoh's story begin to curl at the edges. And standing at the threshold of the end is a woman whose face the world will never forget. Cleopatra. Her name evokes drama, seduction, politics, tragedy. But tonight, we care about none of that. Tonight, we focus on the crown. Or more precisely, what Cleopatra put on her head and why it mattered more than anyone realized. Because Cleopatra VII wasn't just the last pharaoh of Egypt. She was the last person to wear the crown of Egypt and make people believe it still meant something. Now, let's get one thing straight. Cleopatra was not Egyptian by blood. She was Macedonian Greek, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. But unlike many of her Ptolemaic ancestors, she spoke Egyptian fluently. She embraced its gods. She aligned herself with its oldest symbols. She was a queen who understood that ruling Egypt required more than armies. It required appearances. And that meant wearing the right crown. In public temples and religious art, Cleopatra is almost always shown in full traditional regalia. The vulture crown of Nekhbet, the horned crown of Hathor, the sun disk of Ra, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Even, in one exceptional relief, a solar headdress flanked by 6 cobras, because moderation is for amateurs. Each crown was chosen deliberately. Each one said, "I belong to this land. I speak with its gods. I am not just your queen. I am your pharaoh." Historians still argue whether Cleopatra believed these things herself or simply knew how to play the part. But the art doesn't lie. The symbols are loud, confident, and deeply rooted in Egyptian tradition. She did not borrow the crown, she inhabited it. You find yourself now walking beside the reliefs at the Temple of Hathor in Dendera. There, Cleopatra stands with her son, Caesarian child of Julius Caesar, heir to 2 empires. She wears the cowhorn crown, the symbol of Isis. Her son wears the double crown. A message is being sent to every priest and pilgrim who sees it. This is the Divine Mother. This is the child. King. Egypt endures. You imagine the sculptors working late into the night to get it just right. The curve of the crown, the coil of the uraeus, the tilt of the feathers. Cleopatra wanted no doubt, and indeed for years there wasn't. She held Egypt together with diplomacy, alliances, and an ability to move between worlds. Rome saw her as exotic. Egypt saw her as sacred. She was the crown fluid. Adaptive, always dazzling. But of course, we know how the story ends. The Roman war machine rolled east. Cleopatra aligned herself with Mark Antony. The war was lost. Octavian the future, Augustus claimed Egypt, not with a siege, but with a whisper. "It's mine now." The last native dynasty had no more crowns to wear. Still, Cleopatra refused to be erased. In the days before her death, she famously had herself dressed as Isis again. Not as a queen, not as a Roman captive, but as a goddess. You picture her in linen robes, arms draped with gold. Her headdress is tall, symmetrical, crowned with horns and sun disk, cobras curling upward like question marks defying history. Did she wear that crown as she died? We'll never know. But she wore it in her final act, symbolically, spiritually. She made her death part of the myth, the last chapter in a story that had begun with Narmer's palette 3,000 years before. After Cleopatra, there were no more pharaohs. Egypt became a Roman province. Its language, temples, and gods slowly faded. The crowns, once so powerful, became museum pieces, or worse, forgotten. And yet, you sit here tonight, hearing the wind across temple stone, and you know the crown didn't die. It changed form. It slipped out of sight. It became memory. Because Cleopatra made sure of that. She made the crown not just a relic of kingship, but a statement of resistance, of continuity, of sacred identity. Even now, when you picture her, she's not lounging on a couch or dangling grapes into her mouth. She's standing tall, a cobra coiled on her brow, a solar disk burning behind her. The Roman poets called her dangerous, beautiful, too clever, but they forgot the most important part. She wore the crown better than anyone, and in doing so, she made sure the world would never forget it. The sky has turned soft again, paling from deep indigo to the earliest gray of dawn. You've come full circle, back to the stillness of sacred ground, where breath moves slow and thoughts linger like incense. And here, in this quiet, we ask the last question. What happened to the crown after the kings were gone? Not the crowns that vanished into tombs or were melted down by conquerors. Not the ones carved into stone, frozen mid-smiting for eternity. But the meaning of the crown, the feeling it gave, that strange shimmer of belief that hovered around it, like heat above a summer stone. To understand that, you need to go one final place deep underground. You're in the Valley of the Kings now, stepping gently into a tomb so steeped in silence, even your heartbeat seems to hesitate. Walls stretch out before you, lit only by the glow of your torch, every surface painted, every corner humming with memory. And at the center of it all, lying in golden repose, Osiris, not just a god but the afterlife version of every pharaoh. Because after death, each king wasn't just buried. He was transformed, deified, crowned again. In the world beneath this one, it's here that we meet the final crown, the Ataf. A tall white form with curled ostrich feathers, flanked by cobras and sometimes cradled by ram's horns. It doesn't shout, it doesn't conquer, it radiates. This is the crown of the afterlife. The one worn not to command subjects, but to pass judgment, to merge with the gods, to sit quietly beside the river of stars and listen to the deep, slow rhythms of eternity. The Ataf wasn't worn in Lifanode, really. It was too tall, too delicate, too sacred. But in art, in myth, in ritual, it crowns every Osirian king. It's the full stop at the end of the story, and maybe the truest one. Here, the pharaoh no longer needs the double crown. There is no lower Egypt or upper Egypt in the afterlife. No red crown to dominate or white crown to unify. There is only the self, the Sulan, the eternal balance. Even the warlike Kipresh has no place here. You don't need to smite anyone in the field of reeds. There is no battle left to win. Instead, your crown becomes a beacon, a marker, a soft glow in the dark that says, I ruled with order. I lived with purpose. I have become one with the undying. You sit in the tomb's silence, watching how the walls curve around you. Painted gods lift their arms. Stars twinkle above Nut's outstretched body. The crown on Osiris's head sits steady, calm. It needs no explanation. It is the explanation. And the others? The ones who wore crowns in life, who stole them or earned them, who stood beneath sun disks or stars. They come here too. In art, in whispers, in memory. Even their enemies wouldn't take this away. The afterlife crown was above politics. It didn't care who won the war. It only asked, did you bring order? Did you honor the rhythm of things? The tomb darkens as your torch fades, and for a moment, you feel what the crown must have meant. Not as a symbol, but as a promise. a reminder that power is fleeting, but alignment lasts. And now, the journey is nearly complete. But before we let go, let your mind drift once more to that first coronation. The soft rise of flutes, the scent of blue lotus, the crowd parting to let a figure pass, slow and tall, and wrapped in linen. The white crown, then the red, then both together. A snake raised, a vulture watching. No one spoke. They didn't have to, because a crown had arrived, and through it, so had the gods. Now, let all the noise of history fall away. The drums have quieted. The torches have burned low. The sand has settled around the tomb doors, closing them gently against the breath of the desert. And here you are, at the end of the journey, where time folds inward and even the most golden crown becomes weightless. Your body, still. Your thoughts, quiet. You've wandered through temples and tombs, through incense-swirled corridors and sunlit festival courts. You've watched kings rise and fall, and rise again in painted afterlives. You've seen crowns not just as ornaments, but as maps, as whispered prayers in gold and reed and linen. And now, as the final breeze drifts in through the open chamber, you feel something shift. The images fade. The stone walls dissolve into mist. You're not walking anymore. You're floating, gently, above it all, above the two lands, above the temples, above the endless ribbon of the Nile. You are still. The crown is gone now. It's no longer needed. No more symbols, no more rituals. Just breath, just silence, just peace. So rest, traveler of memory. Let the weight slip from your shoulders. Let your heartbeat soften like footsteps on sand. The kings are gone, but their stories still echo, quietly, in the spaces between dreams. Close your eyes, and let Egypt sleep. Cleopatra understood image better than anyone. Her reign was a balancing act between two worlds, Greek logic and Egyptian myth. When addressing Rome, she leaned into intellect. When speaking to Egyptians, she wore the crowns, all of them, together, if necessary. Historians still argue whether she truly embraced Egyptian religion or used it for political convenience. But once again, we're back to symbols. The crown didn't care where you were born. It only asked, "Can you wear me convincingly?" You sit quietly in the shadow of a column, the desert night pressing soft against your shoulders. Somewhere above, the constellations shift unchanged since the first kings carved their names into the earth. And you think of all the hands that passed that crown. From Narmer to Nefertiti, from Horemheb to Alexander, from Ptolemy to Cleopatra, each one adding a layer, each one reshaping the crown just enough to say, "It's mine now." And it always was. And so the crown endures, even as Egypt's sovereignty fades, even as Rome approaches, ready to absorb the land, the gods, the symbols. The last real pharaoh is not Egyptian, but she wears the crowns anyway, because in Egypt, the crown is older than any king, and once you wear it, it changes you. You rise now from the worn stone at Edfu and walk slowly into the morning blue hush of history's final corridor. The torchlight has dimmed. The last pages of the Pharaoh's story begin to curl at the edges. And standing at the threshold of the end is a woman whose face the world will never forget. Cleopatra. Her name evokes drama, seduction, politics, tragedy. But tonight, we care about none of that. Tonight, we focus on the crown. Or more precisely, what Cleopatra put on her head and why it mattered more than anyone realized. Because Cleopatra VII wasn't just the last pharaoh of Egypt. She was the last person to wear the crown of Egypt and make people believe it still meant something. Now, let's get one thing straight. Cleopatra was not Egyptian by blood. She was Macedonian Greek, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. But unlike many of her Ptolemaic ancestors, she spoke Egyptian fluently. She embraced its gods. She aligned herself with its oldest symbols. She was a queen who understood that ruling Egypt required more than armies. It required appearances. And that meant wearing the right crown. In public temples and religious art, Cleopatra is almost always shown in full traditional regalia. The vulture crown of Nekhbet, the horned crown of Hathor, the sun disk of Ra, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Even, in one exceptional relief, a solar headdress flanked by 6 cobras, because moderation is for amateurs. Each crown was chosen deliberately. Each one said, "I belong to this land. I speak with its gods. I am not just your queen. I am your pharaoh." Historians still argue whether Cleopatra believed these things herself or simply knew how to play the part. But the art doesn't lie. The symbols are loud, confident, and deeply rooted in Egyptian tradition. She did not borrow the crown, she inhabited it. You find yourself now walking beside the reliefs at the Temple of Hathor in Dendera. There, Cleopatra stands with her son, Caesarian child of Julius Caesar, heir to 2 empires. She wears the cow-horn crown, the symbol of Isis. Her son wears the double crown. A message is being sent to every priest and pilgrim who sees it. This is the Divine Mother. This is the child. King. Egypt endures. You imagine the sculptors working late into the night to get it just right. The curve of the crown, the coil of the uraeus, the tilt of the feathers. Cleopatra wanted no doubt, and indeed for years there wasn't. She held Egypt together with diplomacy, alliances, and an ability to move between worlds. Rome saw her as exotic. Egypt saw her as sacred. She was the crown fluid. Adaptive, always dazzling. But of course, we know how the story ends. The Roman war machine rolled east. Cleopatra aligned herself with Mark Antony. The war was lost. Octavian the future, Augustus claimed Egypt, not with a siege, but with a whisper. It's mine now. The last native dynasty had no more crowns to wear. Still, Cleopatra refused to be erased. In the days before her death, she famously had herself dressed as Isis again. Not as a queen, not as a Roman captive, but as a goddess. You picture her in linen robes, arms draped with gold. Her headdress is tall, symmetrical, crowned with horns and sun disk, cobras curling upward like question marks defying history. Did she wear that crown as she died? We'll never know. But she wore it in her final act, symbolically, spiritually. She made her death part of the myth, the last chapter in a story that had begun with Narmer's palette 3,000 years before. After Cleopatra, there were no more pharaohs. Egypt became a Roman province. Its language, temples, and gods slowly faded. The crowns, once so powerful, became museum pieces, or worse, forgotten. And yet, you sit here tonight, hearing the wind across temple stone, and you know the crown didn't die. It changed form. It slipped out of sight. It became memory. Because Cleopatra made sure of that. She made the crown not just a relic of kingship, but a statement of resistance, of continuity, of sacred identity. Even now, when you picture her, she's not lounging on a couch or dangling grapes into her mouth. She's standing tall, a cobra coiled on her brow, a solar disk burning behind her. The Roman poets called her dangerous, beautiful, too clever, but they forgot the most important part. She wore the crown better than anyone, and in doing so, she made sure the world would never forget it. The sky has turned soft again, paling from deep indigo to the earliest gray of dawn. You've come full circle, back to the stillness of sacred ground, where breath moves slow and thoughts linger like incense. And here, in this quiet, we ask the last question. What happened to the crown after the kings were gone? Not the crowns that vanished into tombs or were melted down by conquerors. Not the ones carved into stone, frozen mid-smiting for eternity. But the meaning of the crown, the feeling it gave, that strange shimmer of belief that hovered around it, like heat above a summer stone. To understand that, you need to go one final place deep underground. You're in the Valley of the Kings now, stepping gently into a tomb so steeped in silence, even your heartbeat seems to hesitate. Walls stretch out before you, lit only by the glow of your torch, every surface painted, every corner humming with memory. And at the center of it all, lying in golden repose, Osiris. Not just a god but the afterlife version of every pharaoh. Because after death, each king wasn't just buried. He was transformed, deified, crowned again. In the world beneath this one, it's here that we meet the final crown, the Adif. A tall white form with curled ostrich feathers, flanked by cobras and sometimes cradled by ram's horns. It doesn't shout, it doesn't conquer, it radiates. This is the crown of the afterlife. The one worn not to command subjects, but to pass judgment, to merge with the gods, to sit quietly beside the river of stars and listen to the deep, slow rhythms of eternity. The Adef wasn't worn in Lifanode, really. It was too tall, too delicate, too sacred. But in art, in myth, in ritual, it crowns every Osirian king. It's the full stop at the end of the story, and maybe the truest one. Here, the pharaoh no longer needs the double crown. There is no Lower Egypt or Upper Egypt in the afterlife. No red crown to dominate or white crown to unify. There is only the self, the Sulan, the eternal balance. Even the warlike Kipresh has no place here. You don't need to smite anyone in the field of reeds. There is no battle left to win. Instead, your crown becomes a beacon, a marker, a soft glow in the dark that says, I ruled with order. I lived with purpose. I have become one with the undying. You sit in the tomb's silence, watching how the walls curve around you. Painted gods lift their arms. Stars twinkle above Nut's outstretched body. The crown on Osiris's head sits steady, calm. It needs no explanation. It is the explanation. And the others? The ones who wore crowns in life, who stole them or earned them, who stood beneath sun disks or stars. They come here too. In art, in whispers, in memory. Even their enemies wouldn't take this away. The afterlife crown was above politics. It didn't care who won the war. It only asked, did you bring order? Did you honor the rhythm of things? The tomb darkens as your torch fades, and for a moment, you feel what the crown must have meant. Not as a symbol, but as a promise. A reminder that power is fleeting, but alignment lasts. And now, the journey is nearly complete. But before we let go, let your mind drift once more to that first coronation. The soft rise of flutes, the scent of blue lotus, the crowd parting to let a figure pass, slow and tall, and wrapped in linen. The white crown, then the red, then both together. A snake raised, a vulture watching. No one spoke. They didn't have to, because a crown had arrived, and through it, so had the gods. Now, let all the noise of history fall away. The drums have quieted. The torches have burned low. The sand has settled around the tomb doors. closing them gently against the breath of the desert. And here you are, at the end of the journey, where time folds inward and even the most golden crown becomes weightless. Your body, still. Your thoughts, quiet. You've wandered through temples and tombs, through incense-swirled corridors and sunlit festival courts. You've watched kings rise and fall, and rise again in painted afterlives. You've seen crowns not just as ornaments, but as maps, as whispered prayers in gold and reed and linen. And now, as the final breeze drifts in through the open chamber, you feel something shift. The images fade. The stone walls dissolve into mist. You're not walking anymore. You're floating, gently, above it all, above the two lands, above the temples, above the endless ribbon of the Nile. You are still. The crown is gone now. It's no longer needed. No more symbols, no more rituals. Just breath, just silence, just peace. So rest, traveler of memory. Let the weight slip from your shoulders. Let your heartbeat soften like footsteps on sand. The kings are gone, but their stories still echo, quietly, in the spaces between dreams. Close your eyes and let Egypt sleep.